When the term gender enters another language, English itself enters, or rather enters again, since it's undoubtedly been there before. And certainly the term gender does not introduce English for the first time into another language. It's fair to assume that English has been entering for a long time. That clearly happens when the term gender is preserved in the second language in its English form. It happens differently when a new word is devised in the second language to approximate the term gender. Of course, as important as it is to consider specific responses to the various arrivals and incursions of English into other languages, I will be restricting myself to thinking about gender, but also what it raises for us about dominant languages that assert themselves in all sorts of languages and what the resistance to gender might consist of. Indeed, what I hope to ask about this evening is why debates about gender as a term do not very often consider the presumption of monolingualism at work in such debates. For instance, when in the United States or the United Kingdom or in Australia we approach gender as a category or a concept, we tend to set aside the fact that we are referencing English usage. We assume in Romance languages that it will be relatively the same, le genre, el género, or that it should be, and that in principle the discussions we have in English are generalizable to an indefinite number of contexts. Indeed, when we argue about gender, and here I am talking about the term, elaborating its meaning or its conceptualization, we are already operating within a monolingual field, unless, of course, we are arguing in another language and gender is a foreign term. But even then, when gender enters as a foreign term and remains oddly foreign in languages other than English, it could be said to burrow into another language as a foreign incursion. It is odd. It doesn't always fit. It raises all the usual questions. What is the foreign doing here? Is it welcome? Has it been invited? Is gender the sign or instrument of an imperial takeover? Is it the McDonaldization of theory? In English, we make various generalizations about gender as if we were referring to a concept and not a specific linguistic usage. One such generalization might be that gender is performative or relational, intersectional or processual. For the most part in English, the presumption is made that what we are arguing about is easily, if not fully, translatable by virtue of its inherent generalizability. Although gender theorists in Anglophone contexts may not always recognize it, they invariably take up an attitude toward translation when they are arguing about gender. There are several senses in which this turns out to be true. First, the term gender within feminist, queer, and trans theory, and throughout the social sciences, comes to us from other sources, both grammatical and sexological. So we are working with a received term. We are affecting a coinage, and we coin it further all the time. Secondly, in practicing theory as we do, our assumptions about the generalizability of our claims rests on a tacit conviction that there will be no disturbance or blockage when gender is translated into other languages. In fact, the political uproar about the entry of the term into non-English language contexts has only intensified in recent years, and I will give some indication of that. Thirdly, gender assignment is a discursive and institutional practice that works upon the body at the time the assignment is made. It continues to work on the body through time. Gender assignment operates according to translation. Since the infant who is gendered called into life as a boy or as a girl, although sometimes the box is left open, must undertake the work of translation from the adult world that is speaking into the infant's own universe of meanings. Jean Laplanche turns out to be important to this argument, since the names the infant is called requires the work of translation on the part of the infant. So I can't pursue those implications here, but if the infant is trying to figure out or make a translation of this, it's a boy, it's a girl, and all the ways that happens throughout life, being boyed and girled actively through speech, then it turns out that one cannot recognize gender or even appropriate gender except through an act of translation. Translation turns out to be a precondition of gender itself, if Laplanche is right and if we can hold on to that notion of translation. So let us consider whether, when some of us debate in English about what gender is or should be, we rarely ask whether the terms we are using are translatable, even though the generalizability of our claims presume that they are. Of course, some of us may not care whether the key terms are translatable, but what does that say about our discourse? That's a problem for translators, although we are often sometimes glad to assist them with their struggles. We do not always consider that the generalizability of our claim, right, our theoretical claim about gender, actually depends on establishing a conceptual equivalence between the terms in different languages, between English and the languages into which the theory is translated. Where there is no conceptual equivalence, we are confronted with a different problem. Of course, one can avert the problem by simply assuming or asserting that gender is not readily translatable because it belongs properly to English or has come to belong to English. On this presumption, we Anglophones invite everyone into English. Want to do gender theory? Come to English. As the established contemporary linguistic frame, or indeed lingua franca, of gender theory, or we export that frame in a beneficent spirit. Polite imperialists, we. Or it may be that philosophically we think gender names a concept, and that the language we use to name or to describe that concept is quite incidental to the concept itself, and that we're engaging in a purely conceptual analysis, not a linguistic one. According to that kind of argument, linguistic usage neither generates nor sustains concepts. Concepts are presumed to have a relative independence from how they are used in language. If gender is one such concept, then gender can be analyzed conceptually without regard to the specific language in which it is used, or indeed the language in which it makes sense. This last view, of course, the conceptual analysis view, cannot take account of the problem of conceptual non-equivalence that emerges in the practice of translating gender. Sometimes this emerges as a grammatical problem. How to use the noun form of gender in a language, for instance, that only inflects gender through verbs or adjectives. Sometimes it is a syntactical disturbance, meaning that the very joints that hold a sentence together cannot operate, challenging sense-making itself. That happens in languages that describe action, like coming or going, and inflect the verb to indicate whether he or she is coming or going, they or we, I or you. Gender in those cases is not self-standing. It's always a property of something else. This accords, for instance, with anthropologist Marilyn Strathern's notion that categories such as man and woman are abbreviations of social relationships, that they do not have an independent ontological status outside of those relationships. Although these are serious problems for translators, they also pose a problem for theory. If it turns out that gender is always a problem of translation, then the translator and the theorist may not be separate. They may be, in fact, they may be the same, not only in fact, but in principle. Indeed, we are with gender confronting both a theoretical problem for translation and a translation problem for theory. So what I've tried to name so far as a problem is certainly familiar to those who regularly work among languages or for whom English is a second language or third or fourth. But I have yet another point to make that may not immediately appear to follow. And that is simply, as I've already suggested, that translation is the condition of possibility of gender as a useful category of analysis. I called Joan Scott and asked if she agreed, and she said yes. So I'm allowed to use her frame. My view is that the problem of translatability is an unmarked presumption of a monolingualism that pervades the discourse on gender as it crosses academic and popular life. Derrida refers to monolingual obstinacy to describe the resistance to translation. In his monograph, Monolingualism of the Other, he describes the conviction that strengthens as one enters ever more deeply into one's own language to argue a point. One not only inhabits that language as one's home, but the sense one has is that only in that language and in no other language can one make sense and communicate the sense of things. So I not only speak this language, but this language is my way of inhabiting the world and the very essence of who I am and the very condition of the sense I make of the world. Derrida counters this conviction. He knows this conviction, he reports on this conviction, and then he starts to counter this conviction, if you know this wonderful book. And he does this first by claiming that one's own language is never really one's own, surely not a possession, and not exactly a domicile. It is one's own language already, and from the start, a sphere of non-belonging. Language has its life. Language is alive before we utter any word, and it always precedes us arriving from elsewhere. That elsewhere, in Derrida's view, is there at the inception of the speaking subject, and it never really goes away. And yet monolingualism not only covers over this originary condition, a condition of being dispossessed in language, but intensifies our sense that whatever we utter in the language we speak is immediately generalizable. He ventriloquizes the defensive posture of the monolinguist when he writes the following, and of course I am using the English translation here. It's already not his language, this language that was never his language. I quote, "Not only am I lost, fallen, and condemned outside the French language, I have the feeling of honoring or serving all idioms. In a word, of writing the most and the best, when I sharpen the resistance of my French, the secret purity of my French, hence its resistance, its relentless resistance to translation, translation into all languages, including another such French," end quote. The intensification of monolingualism produces a paradox, if not an aporia. The language one inhabits as one's own is, as it were, where one is dispossessed from the start, for in language one speaks, or in which the language one speaks, or in which one writes, one has no rights of ownership. And yet every refinement of thought within that language intensifies the sense that this is one's own language, this is the language that makes most sense, resulting in a resistance to translation. Translation threatens the monolinguist with a loss of place and property in language. Yet in one's own language, one is already dispossessed. In fact, what occurs in one language cannot be completely or adequately translated into another. Thus, Derrida argues that every translation founders on moments that cannot be translated. The untranslatable haunts every translation, not only as a small problem here and there, but as a structural condition that makes itself known in those moments of grammatical faltering and syntactic disturbance that happens nearly every time, for instance, that the English word gender enters into another language. I was going to turn to gender debates in France, but I think I won't. I can talk about them later if you want. But I want briefly to suggest how and why gender cannot escape translation, how gender is from the start a problem of translation and transposition, and only comes into being as a term as a result of such linguistic procedures. Indeed, it comes into a term when it is translated from one field into another. It comes into a term for gender theory or for us. So I will consider some specific instances when the arrival of gender produces a set of problems. And finally, I will suggest that translation opens up the productive potential of errancy and coinage, challenging ideas of linguistic mastery, offering indeed a path of linguistic humility for English and a possibility for encounter that preserves the untranslatable dimension of any language. The untranslatable dimension of gender opens up the question of how to cohabit in a world when conceptual non-equivalence is part of the increasingly global feminist, gay, lesbian, trans conversation. For some, this theoretical notion of gender is unreadable, and not just because the language is difficult or the theory is obscure. It raises a problem of translation and translatability. On the face of it, the problem seems to be one of semantics, but it emerges from a broader sense that the syntactic organization of sense-making within a national language, or indeed a religious framework, is imperiled. My favorite example was that of a woman from French-speaking Switzerland who came up to me at a public event and in French told me that she was going to pray for me. And I asked why. Why would you pray for me? And she said, because you don't believe in natural law and you don't believe in God's word. I asked her whether there was variation in nature, and she wasn't interested in that. And then I asked her whether she had read anything that I had written, and she said, no, of course, of course not. I would never read such a book. Right, I would never read that. Right, she wouldn't even absorb it through reading. Okay, so there we are, beautiful conditions for conversation. So though in such an instance we're not exactly in the realm of thoughtful debate or the presentation of evidentiary claims, something socially significant is happening which calls for some serious reflection, a cultural reading, or even a redefinition of the task of theory. So though I started, say, in French-speaking Switzerland or indeed in France, as someone who participated in those debates, struggling in French to defend and refine a set of theoretical views or relying on translators who sometimes really got it wrong, I slowly became an observer of a fraught political situation, trying to understand the volatile trajectory of this term that nobody owns. Although the opposition to the term gender continues to be fierce, the opposition to la théorie du genre, the development of new gender studies programs in the French-speaking world happens all the time. Indeed, more than 3,000 French researchers met in Lyon in 2016 to present work on études du genre. Psychologists, sociologists, historians, medical researchers, philosophers, linguists, and anthropologists, and psychoanalysts. Those views are not always easy to find represented in a popular media that prefers to circulate an increasingly ferocious phantasm of gender informed by anxieties about sexuality, the family, national borders, migration, and reproductive technology. At the same time, Pope Francis this year agreed to adopt language proposed by his conservative family council that gender is a diabolical ideology. For all his interesting and promising vacillations on matters of sexuality, in addition to his admirable efforts to make the church more inclusive and even to address sexual abuse in the church, the Pope sadly adopted this language, and that has had a huge effect around the world. Why has gender become such a proscribed term? Well, in France, the teaching of gender in the schools as part of a state-approved curriculum is no longer allowed, and in recent months, similar laws have passed in Brazil, in Italy. There are now bitter debates in Poland, Turkey, and Serbia. In Spain, the RAE, the Real Academia de Lengua, refuses to accept gender into the language because it is apparently a Puritan deflection from simply saying sex. That's one of my favorites. So sex and sexuality are conflated while gender is prohibited. Okay, we have much work to do. Whatever the term gender might once have meant, it is for the most part quite transformed through translation, as it now becomes a specter to be fought and defeated by evangelicals and right-wing Catholics alike. Those of us who sought to craft precise meanings for the term have found ourselves surprised by the public appropriations and translations, the phantasms that have replaced our formulations, and the full-scale resistance to the term itself. Indeed, gender, the academic term, the debates on gender, are both now bound up with the question of whether the word, the theory, the politics for which it is imagined to stand can be let in, or whether it should be barred at the border, and all this as a result of religious, social, and political fears and anxieties. The life of the term has exceeded and confounded any original intentions or animating aims it may once have had in the English language context. The term has, in fact, entered into other zones than the ones in which I live, and it takes my name with it, challenging, by the way, my monolingualism. No one owns this term, and no one ever did. The implications of this primary dispossession have taken on heightened significance right now, since we cannot exactly take it back, nor can we exactly let it go. As you probably know, in the United States, the term gender was introduced by sexologists in the 1950s who were interested in regulating bodies that did not immediately fit into the category of male or female. The term started to acquire its contemporary meaning with the publication of John Money's Harvard dissertation on hermaphrodites in the late 1940s. Money sought to develop behavioral techniques and surgeries that would bring intersexed children into conformity with existing gender norms. If a child was born with anatomically ambiguous features, Money and his team sought to find a way either to correct the body or to bring it into line with gender norms as they understood them. But by the 1970s, of course, feminists strongly criticized Money and sought to understand gender as a culturally variable phenomenon, and they refused the idea that there was one way to be or become a man, or be or become a woman. They didn't always do such a great job with intersex, but that movement has made significant strides in the last years. Gender arrived at the doors of feminist analysis already worked over by pre-feminist, even anti-feminist sexologists. Throughout the mid-50s, as Jennifer Germann has shown, gender only signified a relation between words. But with the publication of Money's Harvard dissertation, and in the subsequent years, Money came to use the term gender to describe what a person is, giving it an ontological status. So the very possibility of asking, what gender are you, or what gender is the infant, was not really a possible question in English until later in the 1950s, and more prominently in the following decades. Quite contrary to feminist and queer appropriations of the term, the original deployment of gender was in the service of gender management programs with strong and cruel normative plans. Money sought to identify and correct people with intersex conditions, understood as mixed primary sexual characteristics, that produced the question for him of how such a body could possibly conform to existing gender norms. Mixed or ambiguous anatomy posed for Money a serious problem of what he called social adaptation. How could such a child come to live a happy or a normal life as a woman or a man? And for those of you who follow 1950s melodrama, you know that happiness and normality were the two guiding norms, at least for the white community. The category was bound up in that context with the imagined normativity of a life. Money expected gender to mirror sex, for sex to be identifiable, and for gender to be normative. He expected that an infant would develop along normal lines, so he thought that gender should follow from sex, that sex establishes an expectation of social roles, and that gender is the fulfillment of that expectation. In the view of sexologists at that time, and still unfortunately in many places in the world, intersexed children constitute a disturbance to be managed in order to realize a so-called normal developmental trajectory for the child. It was this perceived failure to conform to the expectation of what a sexed infant was supposed to be that first brought about the notion of gender. Developmental expectations were not met, could not be met, or they were confounded. There was, as it were, a deviant beginning that called to be corrected before the future of the child could be realized. In this context, gender named a problem, an errancy, a deviation, an incommensurability. It was a failure to actualize the developmental norm. It exposed the fact that sex and gender do not always match. Indeed, there could not be a concept of gender in English at that time without the presumption that sex and gender do not always match, by which we simply mean, according to their framework, that normative gender could not necessarily be imagined for the infant on the basis of the infant's bodily constitution. So, in a sense, what Money did was expose the fact that sex and gender do not always match, that the one does not mirror the other, that the one does not follow the other. No mimesis, no causality, no clear, predictable development. Gender was the name for that incommensurability, that unpredictability, that disturbance. The sex of the intersexed infant seemed to be different from either gender category that was available. So the question is posed, well, is it a boy or is it a girl? How do we decide on what basis? That question could not be easily answered. The unanswerability of the question led to the contemporary use of the term gender. Money's solution was to assert gender as a developmental and social norm, to decide with him and his team what normative gender is and what it should be like, and to force, literally, infants onto that path in order to realize that normative expectation. His question was, how do we remake these bodies so that they fit the norms that we have and that are the norms of society, and presumably will always be the norms of society? He never asked whether the norms were wrong. He never asked whether the norms were too exclusive, too restricted. He never asked whether norms could change, even dissolve, to make room for those bodies. Sometimes parents or doctors had to decide which gender an infant should be. At such a moment, gender becomes a defining attribute of a person, something that the person is, without which the person could not be, could not exist, at least not in any social sense. Outside of gender is monstrosity. When medical professionals did not know how to refer to the infant, shall we say he or she, they asked the question of what gender the infant should be, right? So they resolved a problem of unclear usage, pronomial usage, through establishing an ontological scheme. he or she became new ontological categories by which persons could be described and distinguished from one another. In a way, they moved beyond one grammatical function of gender in English, pronomial reference, and coined a new grammatical function, one that produced the ontology of gender as a result. The question of what you are called, or what you should be called, became a different question. Under which category do you fall, and who are you, really? Many problems emerged from this approach, including social engineering and the imposition of narrow and fixed gender norms. But even though sexologists like Money thought they found a way for ambiguous bodies to be classified under categories, they named and brought to light the incommensurability of bodies with those very categories. And this was an incommensurability that was not restricted to intersex infants and children. Sex was not gender. Money's task was to find a way to assign gender and to give the assignment ontological status. One has a gender or is a gender, and that is established through assignment or surgical or behavioral procedure. So he was making persons, right? He was making the ontology of persons. And he was making gender into an ontological category, which it had not been. The norm according to which the body is supposed to live out its time, the norm that organizes the life of the body, conditioning its viable futurity, is precisely that which has already proven to be non-determining. So the ontological status that is established by the sexologists for the body is precisely one that is induced by the naming practice itself. Money and similar practitioners presumed something was wrong, and that brought them a challenge. Something might be wrong, and that meant that these bodies needed to be controlled and crafted into normative forms. There was no operative sense that the person they were naming might at some point in time wish to decide how they might like to name themselves or how they might like to be called. This was not imaginable as a sphere of autonomy, and the effect of their practice was to suspend the imagining of that autonomy for many people for many decades. In making gender into a noun form, we saw the beginning of locutions, as I've said, such as, what gender are you, or what gender is this person? Check your gender here, in this box. Crawl inside that box and live your life. The category functioned as a predictor of normalcy. Oddly, the sexologists thought that gender would secure the normalcy of social practices and institutions. This, which is, of course, very funny because in so many languages and so many contexts, the term gender is understood to be the disruption of normalcy. It's very paradoxical. These practices and institutions included, for Money, the development of heterosexual orientation. That would lead, hopefully, and without too many detours, to heterosexual marriage, and then procreation with conjugally organized families that would then supply cohesion for society and the state. A social form that would be consolidated as a norm and reproduced as in for future generations. Extremes of surgical and behavioral intervention made this period of sexology into one associated with criminal power. Gender did not just become a name with the power to fix the referent. The body itself was subject to fixing and correcting through cruel and hideous means that left lasting physical scars and psychic scars and constituted, in hindsight, criminal acts on the parts of sexologists and other health professionals who used surgical and behavioral means to achieve their goals. The noun form of gender, operating as it does with its ontological effect, requires a reorganization of syntax as well as a new grammatical usage. A new way of making sense emerges when sentences now take gender as an existential predicate and when new questions can be asked, such as, what gender are you? With the sexologists, gender as a term started to acquire this different usage. English was asked to accommodate a strange term. It was as if in English we had to translate between a former use and a present use. coining the term for its new purposes, meant that usage had to change. It wasn't exactly a foreign term. It was more an improper usage that came to be regarded over time as normal, or as at least understandable in English, or at least in some of its regional and public spaces and policies. So there is no referent that we might call gender that belongs to a pure order of being, or even a translinguistic concept. At least that would be my view. That's controversial, and I'm willing to hear people disagree with me. No one language has the exclusive power to refer to gender, and that means that every way of referring to gender has a certain contingency. We may individually feel urgency and necessity about being referred to in one way rather than another. We may understandably feel disrespected if we are referred to in the wrong way. Those may be moments of monolingual obstinacy or failing to see that the work of translation is obligatory. But it can also be an occasion for feeling humility about the particular language we use, whether it is English, French, Chinese, Spanish, or Tagalog. There is no one language that can monopolize that referent, no one mode of representation, no one medium. So sometimes those various versions of gender clash depending on the language, the media, the frame. Of course, this can be hard, since if we understand our gender now to be part of what we are, this is who I am, and if we seek to refine the language of who we are in a monolingual context, drawing on the lexicon and grammar of that language in order to make ever more precise one's identity, then translation becomes all the more difficult. And it would seem then that one can only get recognition for who one is within a monolingual frame and within a particular linguistic community that understands the terms that one is using. The proliferation of noun forms for gender and sexual identity raises specific problems for translation. Consider the fact that there is no noun form for gender in Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. Gender is communicated mainly through the inflection of verb forms, so it is not, strictly speaking, an attribute of a subject. Sorry. I will turn to that towards the end of my remarks, but right now I want to point out simply this, that when feminists started working with the notion of gender, Gail Rubin and Sherry Ortner in the English language context, what they wanted to be able to say was we can take gender out of the sexological context and we can actually make it into something which works for feminism. And of course, one of the points they wanted to make was precisely that there is no one path for becoming a gender. There's no one developmental trajectory. And if we stay within the binary gender frame for the sake of exemplifying the historical argument, both women and men are socially organized ways of inhabiting a body in a broader social world. The task of critical anthropology in the 1960s and 70s was to uncover and track the cultural or historical processes by which gender was established. Joan Scott put it this way: when American and English feminists borrowed the term gender from the writings of John Money and Robert Stoller, they could be said to have performed its second translation. Translation here means moving a term from one context to another and thereby altering its meaning. Money and Stoller had previously taken the grammatical category to distinguish between anatomy, sex, and social role, social identity, gender, in order to resolve the dilemmas faced by intersex children and to justify medical interventions. When feminists took up the term, they did so in order to refuse the idea that biology is destiny, that whatever your sex may be, your gender will follow. The motivation was political, not medical, and it troubled, rather than accepted, the normative male-female dichotomy with which the endocrinologist and the psychiatrist had worked. Scott rightly points out that Stoller and Money made a distinction between sex and gender, and that meant that whatever the sex of the infant, the gender could be acquired through behavioral technologies. Only a few of those feminists who critically appropriated the sex-gender distinction from sexology returned to the original scene of that naming practice to consider the cruelty of sexology and the brutal treatment of intersex children. Of course, in recent years, many have done precisely that, and now contemporary writers, such as Paul Preciado and Catherine Clune-Taylor, have given important consideration to this dimension of the genealogy of gender as a term. But some of them, like Alice Drager, write extensively on the practice of gender assignment and sought to lend support to some intersex groups at the beginning of her career. In the meantime, however, she entered into a controversial debate about whether intersex should be diagnosed as a disorder and whether it should be understood in particular as a disorder of sexual development. As you can imagine, there's been a huge outcry against that particular way in which intersex is now understood by the diagnostic standard manual. Terrible echoes of John Money have in fact returned through this most recent formulation. One reason to be adamantly opposed to that diagnostic category is that it forgets the earlier feminist critiques of developmental models and proves complicitous with the pathologizing cruelty of the diagnostic category. Now, some gender theorists have argued about whether there can be genders that go beyond man and woman. I am usually asked throughout the world, how many genders do you think there are? Or do you believe in an infinite multiplicity of genders? Although sometimes I'm asked whether gender itself should be transcended, that should we be living in a world where there are no gender categories? My own view is that we should seek to bring about a world that is more livable for the many relations to gender that exist, the many languages for gender, and the many ways of doing or living a gendered reality. Some people very much like the binary framework for gender, and they want to find their right place either as a man or as a woman, and to live peaceably, if not happily, within its terms. For them, gender is a prerequisite for inhabiting the world. They want to be able to name themselves with the category and to recognize themselves and to feel at home in the language of gender that they speak, and to find themselves acknowledged also in the name by which they are addressed by others. Ethically considered, such claims are to be honored radically and without question. At the same time, there are others who cannot live very well, cannot find a livable life, cannot breathe very well within those binary terms, who are non-binary, they may be trans, who understand themselves to be critical of the binary. And for them, other gender vocabularies are required for inhabiting the world, for feeling at home, or relatively at home, in the language they use, or in refusing the language that is used in reference to them. That refusal is also an opening onto a habitable world. And so, reasonably enough, there are some who ask for new lexicons or for ways of living outside the category of gender altogether. They press coinage to a further extreme and for another purpose, or they abandon the practice of naming, undertaking a strike against gender as we know it. In fact, all of these are legitimate positions because each of them tells us about a group of people who are searching for livable lives within the language that they find or make or refuse. Indeed, one cannot actually be against any of these positions. This is not something we should be arguing about, because each of them opens up a different trajectory of hope for living a livable life for someone. Given that not everyone finds the same terms to enhance livability, we have to be careful not to impose a new gender norm that generalizes the conditions of livability, or that decides without consultation what someone should be called. Some of the debates about cisgender bring this to the fore. We have to be prepared to translate between a language in which we live and another language that dispossesses us from that sure sense of things that comes with monolingualism. After all, some find life and breath by escaping the terms by which recognition is conferred, and others find life and breath through finally feeling recognized by existing terms or by crafted terms. Some welcome or make the foreign term as a way of busting open the naturalized function of language. Let's remember that Adorno found hope in the foreign word precisely for that reason, as he sought to unsettle the connection between monolingualism and nationalism in Germany. Of course, my own conclusion would doubtless be enraging for those who believe that the gender binary is mandated by a version of natural law referenced by the Bible. In fact, the Bible is much more interesting on gender. And I was going to say to her, you don't read my book, but I read yours. Because gender, in fact, has many different, there's great work being done in religious studies and in schools of theology everywhere on gender meanings. People come to me with all kinds of projects. It's just stunning. In fact, all you have to do is go look at Montaigne or Bellini. It's like, this is the biblical story. This is the New Testament. Where you look at all the gender variations we have there. It's really quite amazing. Okay. In any case, my suspicion has been confirmed that gender theorists like me do not even own their own name, and that names in general mark a particularly interesting way of being dispossessed in language. That form of dispossession, underscored by Derrida, happens precisely at the moment of a most intensified monolingualism, when the language I use to declare who I am turns out fundamentally not to be my own language. That is doubtless different from the imperial incursion of English into contexts that understandably resist the syntactical disturbance it introduces. In those contexts, gender is not only a term that comes from the outside, but a figure for the unwanted foreign element, the one that should not be assimilated. Especially if gender is understood as another import from the United States. Indeed, some have gone even further, crediting the concept of gender to Jewish feminists and or lesbians, right, who are interested in bringing down Christianity, and who are not only responsible for creating this godless and diabolical doctrine, but who seem to be the devil itself. That's not fun, I can tell you. Which is one reason we need Bolsonaro not to be elected. Okay. One can be quite sympathetic, I think, to the resistance of the infiltration of American culture everywhere. I certainly understand that. Why should any linguistic regions suffer from another incursion by the United States? And yet, in some countries, like France, they're certainly living out their own empire, seeking to patrol their border, or arresting or expelling undesired forms of foreignness. Those discourses resonate with the expulsion of destabilizing foreign words. And as Bruno Perrault has argued, the anxiety about gender in France centers not only on French national culture, but on the interruption of future pathways for its transmission and reproduction. My suggestion is that translation allows us not only to affirm the contingency of the language we speak, seeing it as only one way of making sense of the world, but also one way of being affected by those with whom we are in some kind of exchange based on translation. That means that something foreign enters language, destabilizing the smug assumption that, for instance, the grammatical structure of French is the very structure of reason, a belief I would submit that many French people actually hold. Experiments with grammar riddled with foreign words produce an impure language, potentially disrupting national identity at the level of language use, where we are always stumbling to find the right words and allowing ourselves to feel less sure, less certain than we can when we live in a world of shared grammatical and syntactical assumptions or presumptive monolingualism. At the moment one has to explain gender in another language, one sees that one's own language is but one way of trying to present the phenomenon, and that the phenomenon changes depending on the mode of its presentation, sometimes becoming resistant to translation, as Derrida has suggested. We may find ourselves increasingly unable to communicate who we are across languages. That result is problematic, for that means in order to be who we are, we have to stay within a monolingual world and defend its borders against incursion by anything foreign. So let me return briefly to languages that don't have gender as something that is separate, right? That only functions through action and adjective, through verbs and adjectives, and then I will conclude my remarks. In Chinese, as I understand it, gender is bound up with grammar, variously expressed by the conjunction of phonemes and numbers. The term for gender is jing for, bie, tu. The numbers denote tones, and there are 4 of them for each of the 2 terms. Thus, jing tu means something different than jing for. Indeed, this Roman system that I'm using to write this out is already a translation of Chinese characters, so makes something of a grid out of a graphic sign. Jing for is a term meaning category or kind, but it also means sex, and so sustains a relation with those languages that link sex to species. Only at the beginning of the 20th century, so in cases such as this, I think we can see clearly that when gender suddenly becomes part of the argument, it becomes very difficult to translate. And what it means is that something very awkward and clunky and unwieldy has to enter the language. So I have suggested this evening that as much as we seek to own and master the language of the self, we are dispossessed in language precisely when we seek to break out of the national frame, a singular and dominant language, to reach and be reached by a broader world, multilingual and multisyntactical. So the most treasured of our nouns come apart as we come to value translation and the important possibilities that loss of mastery open up. As much as we make a public claim for how gender should be, we also come up against the conditions and limits of communicability itself. Even as we formulate language in which we assert and own ourselves that we are not, in some sense, dispossessed by a language whose history, are we not, also dispossessed by a language whose history and force precedes and exceeds us. By the way, it is that paradox involved in all acts of public naming that we call performative. So though gender may not be performative for many who wish to make a different claim for how they live their gender, the making of whatever claim they do make, publicly, legally, poetically, is perhaps the most important sense of performativity to be preserved for the present. I've suggested that we have to consider the constraining limits of monolingualism, but I've also suggested that John Money and the social engineers of gender made the mistake of thinking that by mastering the naming practice, they could, through their words and their corrective surgery and their brutal forms of behavioral therapy, propel a life in the direction of a full adaptation to existing or imagined social norms. Money and his colleagues were responsible for cruel and criminal procedures. They made many lives unlivable. And what they failed to realize is that being called gender consolidates us neither at the level of language nor at the level of ontology, for there is no simple commensurability between the norm and those who are required to embody its naturalized form. Gender, for the most part, leaves us rudderless and enigmatic to ourselves. And Jean Laplanche, in his late work on gender, noted that gender assignment is the situation in which the infant receives an enigmatic desire from the adult world. What are they calling me? What is that name? What does gender want of me? That's the question of the infant. So gender assignment does not work effectively to produce the creature who conforms to the norm. Gender emerges, rather, at the very outset as enigmatic and as foreign. It poses a task of translation for the infant, and the task is never quite completed in the course of a life. For Laplanche, one never fully overcomes the foreignness of the language in which one dwells. Perhaps this is an alliance he has with the work of Derrida and maybe even Adorno. Those lifelong efforts to decipher and translate a demand imposed by the categories and names does nothing more than open up a zone of provisional freedom where we claim or coin a language of our own in the midst of a linguistic dispossession for which there is no reversal, no remedy, no exit. For what we call our language is and is not our own, and the terms by which we seize ourselves may or may not be translatable even to ourselves. The untranslatable may be another name for the desire that exceeds every effort at lexical capture and normative control. It may constitute that pause or break in language that calls us to attend ethically to one another. It may also, for those of us who live in English, point to the value of faltering in a foreign language, ceding the mastery of monolingualism for a world in which we are, luckily, dispossessed together, fathoming as we can, through terms we both find and make, a more livable way of inhabiting the world. Thank you very much.